So, hello, ladies and gentlemen. It's my pleasure to greet you now from central of Moscow, from our improvised studio at Butersky Val, at an exclusive guest speaker event that we co-organized with IE Business School and MChem, Russia. Let me introduce myself. I'm Yuri Praslov. I'm responsible for corporate communications and marketing at Russian Managers Association. I'll say a couple of words why we decided to touch this topic. All the world has come through a very difficult period, but we thought that we were a little bit within our own kind of viewpoint, and we needed somebody from outside to a little bit let us reflect on what has really been happening and what will be happening after the COVID. What are the implications for geopolitics, for business, for the increasing role of governments, if any, and how is it with the tendencies of the trade wars and supply chain disruptions that we have seen a lot throughout the last several months. We have all been affected by the situation, being forced to digitally transform our organizations, our patterns of life, and combat the crisis that has really become universal. The world has never been faced with such a crisis. And I'm very grateful that IE has given us such opportunity to speak with a global mind. And it is just another from a series of events that we have started since beginning of the year. We have talked to Professor Esposito on March 13th, which was a very successful event, one of the last hybrid events where the speaker was on a Zoom, like I'm with you now, but the audience was offline. I think that modern technologies will bring us together today, not just members of Russian Managers Association, members of MChem, who is a friendly organization and also advocating a lot for business, American business, Russian business, working globally. Let me pass the introduction word to Natalia Schneider. I see that Natalia is now with us, yeah. And then to Victoria Susakova for the presentation of the professor. So Natalia, I hope you have been well, and we have witnessed a lot of events from MChem. Some of those I have participated myself in. Yeah. What are the words that you'd like to address?
Thank you, Yuri. Good afternoon, everyone. So thank you, Association of Managers of Russia, for organizing this event. And we're actually very, we're glad that we're partners of this event, and then we can bring also our members. And I would say that IE Business School is MChem member and in very good stand. And in the past, we have a lot of a series of meetings with the professors of the school face to face. Now we're in a new reality, and it's online, but I think it's very important, especially in the current situation, and to see what the post-COVID world prepares for us. Not only post, even the current COVID world is very interesting, but post-COVID world will be even more interesting. So I wouldn't take your time. So welcome everyone, and we're looking forward to a very interesting presentation and discussion. Thank you.
Yuri, I think you are on mute.
I just like to say that our session will be transmitted through Facebook, so you can also ask questions from there. And from our experience, it gathers a lot of audience. Now I pass the word to Victoria. Victoria, how are you? You've been very active also in masterminding this event, yeah. Which we are very grateful. And finally, we have the pleasure to have the professor.
Yes, thank you very much. I'm very excited to be here. I'm very excited that this event is happening. Thank you everyone for connecting. Thank you very much to our partners from the Association of Managers and the American Chamber of Commerce for all your support. I just wanted to introduce very briefly IE Business School for those of you who may be not very familiar with our institution, and then I'll pass the word to Milo. So IE Business School was founded back in 1973 in Madrid by a group of Spanish entrepreneurs. We are currently one of the best business schools in Europe and worldwide. We offer a wide range of programs, starting from bachelor's to master's to MBAs and executive education. And we actually especially advanced when it comes to online teaching and what we call liquid learning, which became especially relevant these days. And everybody is now embracing the concept. And we are very happy to see that, because we have been firm believers in this format for many years already. And I personally think that it's a great opportunity for everybody, because what is happening is that I'm currently connecting from St. Petersburg, Yuri is in Moscow, Milo is connecting from Warsaw. I'm sure that you guys are connecting from different places as well. And I think it's beautiful that, you know, thanks to technology, we are able, you know, to get together from different places in the world. And as I said, that's our firm belief at IE as well, that this kind of education, that this format is the way to go in the future. Now I'd like to say a couple of words about Milo Jones. Thank you, Milo, for being here with us today. Dr. Milo Jones teaches subjects such as business and geopolitics and analytical tools for business decision-making at IE, among other subjects. And in his teaching, he uses his experience as U.S. Marine Corps officer and management consultant and an investment banker. So Milo has a very interesting background, and I'm sure we're going to have a very interesting discussion today. And I encourage you to ask questions in the chat, because the idea that for today is that it's a dialogue, right? So we would like to engage you in a discussion. Milo will make a brief presentation in the beginning. He will share his views, and then he will open the floor to questions, and we'll help him moderate. So I hope you guys will be very active and will enjoy this session. Thank you very much again. And Milo, floor is yours.
Thank you, Victoria. Thank you, Yuri. Excuse me. And thank you, Natalia. Victoria, when I heard that IE was headed towards liquid learning, I thought I had lots of experience in that, because I thought it involved wine and vodka, but it turns out it involves technology. And I'm not terribly great at answering questions via technology, which is ironic, given what you'll see in my presentation. But I want to say, I want to take about half an hour of your time, and then I want to start taking your questions. But before I do that, I'm going to offer two other pieces of information. The first of which is you will get the slides. So don't worry about that. No need to take notes should you suddenly feel you've been given something worthwhile. The second thing is, I would appreciate it if you have a big theoretical question or even a wild theoretical disagreement, if we could hold that to the end. But if you just don't, excuse me, understand a word I'm using or something, feel free to ask. Maybe I'll be able to see the chat thing. I'll try. And then I know Victoria and so on can stop me and say, wait, no one understands that word or something. The point is, there's no point in you guys listening if I'm not clear. So make sure I'm clear. I'm now going to try to share my screen, and I'm very old-fashioned. I do use slides. And I'm going to go through about a half an hour presentation of geopolitics in the sort of post-COVID-19 world. And I think you should now all see the slides. I know what I'm supposed to address. I'm supposed to address geopolitics after the COVID crisis. And that involves things like you've been told, I'm going to talk about the balance of power between China and the US and the EU and rising players like India, and maybe governments are going to get more involved with business with tighter regulation, and there'll be supply chains disruption, more supply chains disruption, and maybe business becomes more local. And this idea that we're all going to work like this forever, being in Warsaw, I kind of hope not, to be honest. I used to travel 200 days a year. I mean, I like Warsaw, don't get me wrong, but gosh, ja lubię Moskvę, także. And I'm going to talk about the fake news and media. I could do those things, and I will do those things. But then everyone's going to want me to start talking about all these possible second order effects of the crisis. Like, oh my gosh, all these governments are spending lots of money, these so-called fiscal and monetary bazookas, and we don't know where that goes. And then there is the impact of these demand shocks to the so-called US-China-EU trade war, and maybe US and China techno-nationalism is rising. And some people say, oh, but if we start deglobalizing, that will lead to automation, and that leads to more unemployment and instability. And then there's this price war you may have heard of, involving oil, and you add that to the COVID-19 crisis. And then you start wondering about places like Iran's stability or Saudi stability. And then you can never forget our friends in North Korea. In 1996, during a famine, one of the Army Corps there mutinied. Who knows what they'll do this time around? And then there's the sort of disturbing thought that COVID-19, certain disturbed minds might consider it a sort of proof of concept and say, gosh, you know, if we use the technology of CRISPR or other synthetic biology, this is a lovely proof of concept for a new virus we could create. Maybe we could cross HIV/AIDS with mosquitoes and spread HIV/AIDS via mosquitoes, or some terrifying thing like that. And everyone's going to want to hear about, what about Central Asia or Turkey or Venezuela or Libya? Oh, sorry, there's not a Libya anymore. I thought I should be polite and put it in there, but nobody. And then Iraq and Lebanon and Argentina and or Russia. Okay, a friend of mine said, look, we've got COVID-19 and an oil price war, and the black swans appear to be mating and having these cute little baby black swans that are spinning off, and maybe this is not going to be fun. I could talk about all that, and I will if you want me to. But I personally don't like making weather forecasts in the middle of a hurricane. And if you ask me for an historical analogy of where we are, I think we're in about 1929 in American terms, when the stock market crashed. And then it sort of recovered in 1930, which people forget. But then we entered a Great Depression. I know events in Russia were very different at the time. At least you didn't have a stock market crash. But the world entered a period of enormous instability for the next 15 years. And we are, I believe, at the beginning of such a period. Instead, though, of making that forecast immediately and addressing all those wild possibilities, I want to start about what I actually think is going on in geopolitics, and changes that I think the COVID crisis is only accelerating. And you're going to have to be patient with me, because this is going to involve the one word that business people hate, and they're wrong to hate it, but they do hate it. I'm going to have to use some theory, okay? And theory is very practical, in my opinion, because theory acts like the iron filings in this photo. It helps you see forces that are at work that you otherwise wouldn't notice. And I want to share with you what I think is really going on. And then we can talk about COVID-19 and specific questions in that overall important context. Otherwise, what I say won't make sense. So we all are aware, most of us are aware, that all around the world, life is getting more digital. And business people love this. They're like, oh my gosh, this is going to be great. Think of the possibilities with rising smartphone use. And we've got about that this chart is actually from 2018. So we're now well past, a little bit past 50% of all people on Earth having internet access, and about a third of people using social media in one form or another, if things like WhatsApp are counted in social media. And, you know, I haven't lived in America since 1996, but I do know my country spends a lot of time with digital media. I think if you included television in that it would run to 18 hours a day. I don't think people read these strange objects behind me anymore. I think the whole world is digital, and at least America is very digital, and many people, I mean, I'm sure you don't check your phone more than what, 2 or 3 times a day? And we do know digital technologies are evolving. And very soon, it will be perfectly possible to see your favorite or least favorite political person or show business person doing all sorts of things on video, and you won't be sure whether it's real or not. So what I think lies behind COVID-19 and is important to discuss in the context of understanding the impact of COVID-19 is this new paradigm in geopolitics, which revolves around digital technologies. I think if the world seems stranger and stranger, it's not only because of COVID, it's because we're in the midst of a big shift, moving from analog to digital geopolitics. And this is a shift equal to some I'll talk about in a minute, but it is not a trivial cyclical thing. It is a fundamental change in how the world is organized. I think digital technologies are shaping and driving geopolitical change in many realms, and they're actually becoming, and here's where the theory comes in, they're becoming what Aristotle called formal causes. Formal causes don't just have effects. Formal causes cause new forms. Formal causes structure our choices, your political leaders' choices, business supply chains, everything. All your choices are being restructured by the digital. And to understand why this change will be so profound, I'm going to draw on the work of a Canadian media theorist who died back in the 80s, for goodness sake. It's shocking that anyone who lived before we did has anything worthwhile to say. Still, I do know that that's a foreign idea to many people, but actually some of these old theories are useful. And Marshall McLuhan said some intelligent things that shed light on how Russian business ought to be thinking about their business context and their own value chains in a post-COVID-19 world, if we ever get to a post-COVID-19 world. Because, by the way, we've been working on AIDS for 30 years, and we're not there yet. There are no guarantees, but we can get there during questions. So what's going on? Marshall McLuhan used to say, the medium is the message. And I can tell you, even in English, no one is quite sure what the hell that means, okay? If you're going to be a public intellectual, it's important to use words people understand in ways people don't. And then you can seem smart when you explain it. But he actually had a serious point to make with that phrase, so let me explain it to you. He meant that the media, or even technology as a whole, influences what messages are sent and how they're perceived. And in addition, he stressed that the way messages are sent, the medium sending them, is actually more important than any message that is sent on them. So to give you a visual metaphor of what he meant, you can read the message on that bomb. Happy Easter to Adolf, right? That's the message. Fine. But the medium is the bomb. The thing that has the big impact is the bomb, not the message. And Russian business and business all over the world, and politicians all over the world, and people all over the world have to understand that digital technologies are the bomb, okay? They are going to change everything. So stop focusing on any given message that's being sent and start thinking about the impact of what's getting sent, how. And business people love disruption. When I was in business school a long time ago, people love disruption. People like to talk about disruptive innovation and stuff. And I think they haven't quite thought it through, because a lot of things are going to be disrupted besides the traditional taxi business or the way in which we receive our movies. And so people who look for life to get back to normal frequently say, oh, we'll just fix digital media. I wouldn't be so sure at all. As I say, McLuhan suggested digital media are a formal cause. And in fact, he said the reason they are is the communication technologies you use aren't neutral. They actually have massive psychological effects on people who use them every day. And a child born in today's world, I mean, to me, I'm 50, I'm over 50. I won't say how old I am. I'm very coy. But you ask a kid today about Google, to me is still a miracle. I'm so old. But you ask a child today about Google, to them it's just like the toilet. It's there when you need it, you know, whatever. Of course, all the world's information, or much of the world's information, is at my fingertips. How could life be any other way? That has psychological effects. But there's an even deeper level, as I say, that in Aristotle's world, there were 4 types of causes, and you'll be thrilled I'm not even going to talk about 2 of them. But he talked about efficient causes. And that when people say cause and effect, that's what they mean, efficient cause. My favorite question as a consultant, I don't usually say it out loud to the client, but my favorite question as a consultant to myself is, who's responsible for figuring out causes around here? And the answer, of course, usually is nobody, right? Nobody thinks about what causes what. They just do their job, right? Which may be counterproductive. But efficient causes just have effects. But formal causes, like digital technology, they're special. They structure choices. They structure your culture. They change your identity. And that's what's going on. They cause new forms. That's the easiest way to remember the distinction. Formal causes cause new forms, and digital technology is going to be causing new forms. So let me give you some background, some historical context for the scale of change I'm talking about. Around 1450, Mr. Gutenberg invented the printing press, and humanity started moving from handwritten script to mechanically printed type. And if you read McLuhan's book, one of them, called The Gutenberg Galaxy, it's fascinating because he actually traces the impact of this first uniform, mass-produced object from Germany of the 15th century right through to Henry Ford and assembly lines. You don't end up with assembly lines in a world without mechanically printed type. It changes minds. Of course, also about this period is when European countries started forming nations as we think of them today, and when the Protestant Reformation happened in Western Christianity. So it had big consequences. But of course, around 1850, there's another big change. Suddenly, those printed words, they start traveling at the speed of light across oceans. In 1850, around 1850, the telegraph means suddenly the world gets much smaller. And of course, that's when the newspaper starts talking about stuff that happened yesterday on the other side of the world. And that begins to change people's mindset. But you guys know, by the 20s, we moved into the era of the radio, or as the British used to call it, the wireless telegraph. And 30 years after that, we started using wireless telegraphs, radios, to transmit not just voice, but pictures. And people's psychology started to change. Each time. we are now headed towards digitally stored memories. It's not like having a mini TV with you. It's not like having a mini radio with you. It's a different thing. And it's changing what the group I work with calls the psychotechnical environment all around the world, everyone who's using these devices. Let me give you some examples of how media, as Marshall McLuhan calls it, change what messages are sent and how they're perceived. What you have on the screen there, I know you can't read it, is all American school children who go to decent schools anyway, have to memorize this speech. It's something called the Gettysburg Address, and our president, Abraham Lincoln, in the middle of our Civil War in the 1860s, gave it. And it's only 263 words. And we don't have a picture of it because most speakers at the time in the 19th century would get up and spend 3 hours talking. So the photographer wasn't ready. We have a beautiful picture, a blurry picture of Mr. Lincoln getting off the podium because the photographer was like, what? You spoke for 2 minutes. You can't do that. Why? Lincoln gave such a short speech because in the middle of a civil war, he'd spent the last year in the White House watching telegrams come in, reporting the progress of the war, and he wanted to go over the heads of the newspapers, so to speak, and speak directly to the American people without newspapers taking a summary. Mr. Lincoln made the following 4 points. No. Mr. Lincoln wanted to talk directly to the people. So he limited himself to a very short speech. Now, it's a complex, linear speech, still very textual. Like a good American schoolboy, I'll give you the first sentence. Tell me if this sounds simple to you. 77 years ago, our fathers brought forth on this continent a new nation, conceived in liberty and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal. That's a pretty long sentence, and it's a pretty complex sentence, but I want to convince you that it's actually a 19th century tweet, because the new technology allowed Lincoln to go over the heads of existing media organizations, and they printed the speech verbatim because he gave it. It was short enough so they could just take it down and repeat it instead of summarizing. But of course, you guys know that within 60 years, radio came along. And there were some politicians who were pretty good at radio, and it changed politics. Let's see if you've heard of some of them. Adolf Hitler, Winston Churchill, Franklin Roosevelt, Joseph Stalin. Heard of them? They were masters of the radio. And oh, by the way, Lincoln was very tall, very ugly, and had a very squeaky voice. He simply couldn't have been president in the radio age. The media was shaping even who's eligible to be elected, which is why you shouldn't be surprised that by the 1980s and the Cold War that I remember between our two nations, my nation elects who? A Hollywood movie actor, Mr. Handsome himself, who is a master of the medium of television. He was great at it. He'd started in film and he moved on to TV.
Professor, if you hear me, just a short question to understand. By media, you mean traditional media, or you mean just anybody with a live transmission? Because we have been discussing it here locally, and basically we see that the trend is, if I have a mobile and I have some big news happening, or I'm a celebrity, I'm becoming a media.
Yes, Yuri. I understand your question. What I mean, and what McLuhan meant by media, is literally, you can almost substitute the word technology. So it's the difference between this and all the other media I've talked about is there are no editors here. One of the differences, there are no editors here. And it's broadcast and narrowcast at the same time, but we'll get into that. But just to clarify, what I mean by what McLuhan meant by media, what we all mean by media is just a technology. Technology changes your psychology, the use of technology. Now, I live in Warsaw because my wife works for Europe's Border Guard Service. And so, in fact, she's the chief spokeswoman. So she has to deal all the time with all the stuff happening around Europe's borders. And what kind of messages does she receive on this medium here, this media here? Well, usually she has to deal with things like this. That's a dead Syrian boy on a Turkish beach. And how do people respond to that? Do they respond in a rational, linear, textual, logical manner? No. They're post-literate. They go with emojis. They do a sad face. Now, I've tried on a number of occasions to transmit the message. 77 years ago, our fathers brought forth on this continent a new nation, conceived in liberty and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal. I've tried to do that with emojis, but something about the message seems to get lost. Even when I use the poo emoji, I just can't do it. The medium of this phone is shaping the message that are sent and how people think about the world. It's much more emotional. In many ways, it's deeper. In other ways, it's much shallower. So, in effect, because of these psychological impacts of media, I want to suggest to you that we tend to think that great artists produce in a vacuum and the world recognizes their genius. I want to suggest to you not at all. It's the audience who creates the artist. And that new technologies, digital technologies, are producing new audiences. And those new audiences are producing new artists and having new effects. That's why the world seems so strange. I mean, at my most vulgar, I never imagined my country would elect the Cheeto Benito who currently runs the country. It's just shocking. I wasn't a great fan of Lady Macbeth either, but I never thought we'd get there. But we got there because Trump is the Uber of American politics. You're like, Uber, American, how can that be? What did Uber do? Uber used these things, digital technologies, to go over the heads of incumbent service providers, existing taxi companies, to serve customers who felt underserved by the old service providers. Trump used digital technologies like Twitter to go over the heads of the existing political parties and talk right to the audiences, right to the customers who felt underserved by those political parties. Modi's doing it. It lies behind the Arab Spring. It lies behind Brexit. New audiences are being talked to, and they're producing new artists, if you will. And that's happening all over the world. In fact, I think the reason politics everywhere seems strange is there's not a party in the world, and I mean the world, our friends in Beijing included. No party has figured out how to bring both prosperity and perceived fairness to a digital post-industrial society. And they don't know how to resist digital technologies without causing economic harm, so they won't stop. Nobody wants to be North Korea. But maybe we're back to a period like 1850 to 1910, before plain old left and right. Now, you guys won't be particularly surprised to know that I'm not a great fan of Karl Marx's answers. But I would suggest to you that Karl Marx's questions are relevant to the digital age. Wait, there's been a change. There is a changing means of production. And therefore, we should probably be thinking about the organization of a just society in the face of a changing means of production. I don't like his answers. You won't be shocked to learn. I volunteered for the Marine Corps during the Cold War, after all. But his questions were right. And they're still relevant. In other words, post-COVID, politics isn't going to settle down. In fact, one of the things you notice about new technologies, new media, is people tend to refer to new technologies using the vocabulary of the old. So when cars came to the United States, automobiles, they were called horseless carriages because, oh, well, it's like a carriage, but it doesn't have a horse. And that sounds kind of silly, right? I was in, because I'm that kind of guy, I was in the Savoy in London a few months ago in January, and they had the first elevator in London, and it was called an ascending room because, you know, it's like a room, but it moves up and down. In other words, you always talk about new technologies in terms of the old. And if you don't believe me, ask yourself, why do you call this supercomputer you carry everywhere a phone? As a business person, you are not going to begin to understand the potential of this device to change value chains, to change business models, if you keep calling it a phone. Calling it a phone is like calling a car a horseless carriage, or calling a radio a wireless telegraph, or calling an elevator an ascending room. The vocabulary itself gets in the way. So my first practical piece of advice is drop that. Call it something else. I don't know. Don't call it just a smartphone. So most nation states today, most institutions today, and by institutions, I mean things like the United Nations, the European Union, etc., all the nations around us we live in, they're actually products of a different media environment. They're a product of print and radio and TV. And so the key question becomes, how did the old forms perform under digital conditions? Do they last? So let me give you quickly one tool to probe media effects properly, in my opinion, and also as a parallel, and then we'll talk, a historical parallel about what I think the future holds. So McLuhan said, first of all, he didn't like dialectics, okay? This is not about thesis, antithesis, synthesis. But he also didn't like just opposition. So McLuhan said, every time you have a new medium, a new technology of any kind, it enhances some human function. So as an example, a car enhances your legs. A telephone, a normal old-fashioned phone that's wired to a wall, enhances your voice box and your ear. So you need to think of technology as what human function does it enhance? When it does that, it makes some technologies obsolete. Okay, frankly, that's where most business analysts get off the bus. They say, okay, yeah, this is enhanced, that's made obsolete, meh, so what? Don't stop there. Keep going with McLuhan and he'll say, wait, when that technology spreads enough, it actually can reverse and cause problems. So in 1860, you're Karl Marx, you want to cross London, you took a horse and carriage and it probably took about 2 hours. Then the automobile arrives and it speeds up travel across London. Now, with so many cars, you'd be lucky to cross London or Moscow in 2 hours, right? So something starts out doing one thing, and then when it spreads enough, it flips. And finally, the most interesting part of the tetrad for me is often new technologies actually retrieve and bring into the present some forms humanity can recognize, that some parts of an older world get brought back that had gone away. So I'll give you an example. Digital. What does digital enhance most of all? Memory. Everything gets remembered all the time. If I want to understand disorder now in America, Black Lives Matter, etc., most of all, I need to understand that that entire situation is happening because of digital media, not the injustice underlying it. The injustice had always been there. But suddenly, thanks to digital, it's being recorded and remembered. Everything you do is being remembered. And if you want to understand why societies are under pressure, not just in the West, but everywhere, you need to understand that people who don't forget things go crazy. And we're about to find out what happens to societies that never forget anything, to institutions that never forget anything. Just ask the Catholic Church how they like the fact that everything's getting remembered. So everything is not only being remembered, but it's also transparent. So I'll give you one example. There's an app in the United States. In America, if you give more than $200 to any political party, if you're a person or a company, that has to be registered. It's recorded. And if you're a member of the board of directors of any company, that of course is also recorded. So Bipartisan is an app that lets you walk into a store and scan any item's barcode, and it will say, oh, wait, based on the giving patterns of the employee of that company and the board and that company itself, those are quite Republican potato chips, and you want to buy Democratic potato chips, or vice versa. Every object is embedded with politics. It gets remembered. I'm seeing some big questions in chat. I'm happy to take those when I'm just about to finish. Give me 6 more minutes. So, digital enhances memory. What does it make obsolete? Well, it makes obsolete paperwork. It makes obsolete, supposedly, everything behind me. It makes obsolete educational institutions. I'm glad IE is moving to liquid learning, even as it's described now, without the vodka and the wine. But I would suggest to you that all institutions are going to have all educational institutions are going to have a hard time with the digital world, because when your technology remembers everything, school gets flipped. You used to be a smart person if you answered other people's questions correctly. It was very simple. School was simple. You're sorted by date of manufacturer, put in a room, somebody asks you questions, and if you give the right answer, congratulations, you're smart, move to the next level. Suddenly, you'll never be smarter than Alexa or Google or anything else. And the hard part is actually figuring out which questions to ask. And we don't have an educational system anywhere that judges people by the quality of their questions rather than the quality of their answers. That's a real problem. Not to mention all the other legal implications of the world moving from paper to digital. I'll give you one other thing to think about as business people. Moving from paper to digital changes something else you do with paper. Paper money. Money's not paper anymore. Hasn't been for a long time, but it started changing in the analog age, and it's changing even faster now. So that's what it enhances. That's what it makes obsolete. What does it reverse? We all know this. It reverses into information overload. When I was doing my MBA back in the 90s, everybody was very excited about the information age. Now everybody's like, oh my God, information overload, I can't take it. But the most interesting part, I think, is what forms does digital technology retrieve? And again, I think the post-COVID world is just accelerating this retrieval. I think digital technologies retrieve many aspects of medieval life in geopolitics. Oh, that sounds sort of scary. It also sounds somewhat dubious, right? Let me see if you recognize any of these things. Now, maybe you don't. because, you know, we can't imagine what it would be like living in the medieval world, can we? Let's see. In the medieval era, there were these aristocrats, right? And they were sort of an elite, very concentrated, and they had tons of money. And you know what? Their nationality was a little bit ambiguous. They kind of had more in common with other people visiting Davos. Oh, I mean, other people visiting palaces than with the peasantry. They're just a thin gratin on top. I'm really glad we don't live in a world like that anymore. In the medieval world, you had nations and kings and stuff, but you also had these non-state actors who would sort of challenge the state in many domains, right? So you'd have the churches really mattered, and there'd be individual barons that mattered. There'd be great trading cities that matter. There would be lots of different organizations besides states that can kind of on some levels challenge what states do. I'm certainly glad we don't live in a world like that. Oh, and of course, states lacked a monopoly on organized violence. And I would remind you that my country has spent the last 21 years in Afghanistan fighting a non-state actor and trying to turn Afghanistan into Wisconsin. I personally don't think we're going to succeed there, but we're keeping at it. But that's a non-state actor. And we've also been fighting Al-Qaeda and ISIS. ISIS tried to be a state for a while, but you get the point. In the Middle Ages, people had a big identity, and usually it was like religion. And then you were kind of from a place. And there weren't all these middle identities. Maybe it was your trade and your city. And then it was something really big, like I'm a Christian who lives in Kiev. That was kind of it. There was no Ukraine. It was just kind of, so local allegiances. You had new industries and new technologies. My favorites, distilled spirit, invention of the Middle Ages. You also had a lot of new heresies, new ideologies, new religions popping up. And we could be headed for that. And then, of course, you had new plagues. Those were always fun. And I'm kind of live in that era. I'll give a few more details and then I'll take questions. Did you know that 2 years ago, Denmark opened a new embassy? They created an ambassador to Silicon Valley. In other words, you have a king, a nation, courting very powerful baron. They're like, well, we don't need to open another embassy in Mali. Who cares? That's just a country. The people who are really going to matter to the future of the people of Denmark are called Facebook and Google and Apple. That is just like the Middle Ages. And of course, when I say non-state actors, I don't just mean companies. I also mean NGOs. And you know, if you say, well, name some NGOs, of course I mean organizations like Greenpeace and Amnesty International are challenging governments. But I also mean probably the most impactful NGOs of my lifetime, like these guys, okay? You ask me the most impactful NGO of my lifetime, and it's Al-Qaeda. Now, some people think they want to save the rainforest and free prisoners of conscience, and other people think they want to restore the caliphate. I profoundly disagree with those who want to restore the caliphate, but it's an NGO, and digital makes it possible. And they're challenging states on their own ground, challenging the king. Now, I said my wife works for the migration agency, the European Border Guard Service. And it turns out, you know, there's an app that this thing allows you to find a person smuggler. And then you can check their ratings like an Uber driver, right? And you give a rating to your people smuggler, like, well, the boat was kind of crowded, but, you know, we got across the Mediterranean in the end. So you find a people smuggler with your digital technology, you arrange the trip, you pay for it. When people arrive in Europe, they want two things: water and a place to charge their phone. And then they do selfies as proof of life to send home so their parents paid the balance due. Digital feeds migration, doesn't stop it, which is why, just like in the Middle Ages, what are we doing? Hey, I know, build a wall, right? Suddenly, I've got politicians like my own, in my own country, saying Donald Trump ran on build a wall. You know, the wall hasn't arrived yet. Nobody's noticed, but I guess that's an internal question. But all around the world, Hungary, Israel, people building walls again. The state is becoming the castle. And of course, we see it in trade. You guys are business people. Let's talk about medieval trade. How about one belt, one road? Oh, wait, they've even branded it as a medieval trade route, the Tang Dynasty Silk Route. No surprises there. And as I've said, maybe medieval Islam's back on the march. By the way, Apple hates that photo, but if I need to cite in a mortar, I'll use an iPad when it comes. So you got stronger religions back on the march. And in fact, when I think about what's Turkey doing, Turkey is back playing in the world of the Ottomans, in Libya, in Syria, and other places. And I could say the same about Iran. I've got the Persian Empire making a push for the Mediterranean again, making a push into Afghanistan again, etc. And what about Europe? Well, the European Union, remember in the Middle Ages, Europe is built around something called the Holy Roman Empire, and it wasn't terribly effective, but it was sort of this Franco-German combination based fairly near Aachen, well, in Aachen, which is right by Brussels. So you got a Franco-German combination that isn't terribly effective, based near Brussels. Now, I really hope that Spain does not become another emirate, right? So the parallels are not exact, but as Mark Twain said, history doesn't repeat itself, but it rhymes. And what does that mean for Russia? Well, Russia, arguably the last 20 years, Russia's returned in some ways back to earlier forms. Certainly the borders moved. And thanks to the last 20 years, of course, you're also sort of turning east. And if I'm thinking geopolitically, because that's what this is supposed to be about, I'm thinking, well, gosh, you know, what happened in the Middle Ages in the East? And you say, oh, no, don't worry, we're friends with the Chinese now. And I would suggest maybe, but you know, the Chinese have a long memory. And it wasn't that long ago that parts of what we call Russia, they called China. And I'm sure they've forgotten. I wouldn't worry about that at all geopolitically. No problema. Look, be skeptical. Maybe everything I've talked about is nonsense. But if you remember nothing else from this talk, remember in a post-COVID world, should you really think about technologies as neutral? Economists like to call them an externality, which is Latin for stuff we don't want to talk about. But I wouldn't be so sure. I certainly, as much as I would like to believe we're headed for sort of a one orderly world, I don't see it as more likely. I think we need to start thinking about the world under digital conditions and how the way we used to run the world in a pre-digital world, how do those institutions change at least, or do they survive at all under the impact of digital technologies? And then, okay, what about COVID? Well, I think COVID is just accelerating all this. I think it's disrupting very few aspects of this change. I think it's accelerating them. And so now I'm perfectly happy to address the questions you thought I'd be addressing. And I can see on the chat there are some questions already. Victoria, how do we want to do this? Do you want to read them and ask me? Could we do it that way? Because I'm kind of a post-literate guy. I'm not so good at reading the chat, but I could just read some of them if you want. I seem to have trouble sort of seeing some of them.
I think for now we have more comments than questions, actually.
Oh, okay. Uh-oh. Well, I'm really glad I can't read them then. So I am happy to take questions about anything I've said.
Professor, let me ask you the first question. You hear me? Yeah.
Yeah.
A lot of the things that you touched that are mostly connected with politics and how it evolves actually touch a lot of ethics. Is it ethical to use the media? Is it ethical to manipulate? Is it ethical to build walls? And what do we do now when this COVID crisis actually works towards making a bigger gap in availability of these instruments, digital instruments and digital technologies among people? This is clearly seen here in Russia as the small and medium-sized companies from some industries are really touched by the crisis, while some companies are actually okay and thriving and benefiting from this crisis. So the disproportion of wealth doubled by this manipulation, if I understood, acceleration, would that lead to a crisis in ethics? Or it is already with us?
I think that crisis was already with us. And I don't want you to think of digital technology merely as a means of manipulation. I think it's also just about the psychological effects, without humans even being aware of them, that these technologies have. So this isn't necessarily about people using digital technology to manipulate others. It's just the societal changes that happen. But we were already seeing a rising gap between rich and poor, not just in the United States or Russia, but also in countries like India and throughout the European Union. And I think that's because of the impact, broadly considered, of digital technologies, because digital technologies go beyond just the media, and they go to things like automation. So when you can map by county, so America's got 50 states, and then within each state there are counties like an oblast, each one. And when you look at the percentage of businesses, the amount they spent on automation over the last 20 years, and then which counties voted for Donald Trump, you see an exact correlation. The more companies were investing in machines that put pressure on workers, the more people voted for Donald Trump. So the ethical question is, as I say, it's what Karl Marx was asking. In the face of changes to the means of production, how do we ethically organize this society, especially when one of the changes to the means of production allow all this transparency in society where everybody can see what everyone else has? Because the one thing we know is, it's called prospect theory in behavioral economics. It's the idea that your feeling of wealth depends on other people's wealth around you. So if I move you from $2 a day to $10 a day, you say, wow, thank you. Unless there's one guy in the village who moves from $2 a day to $100 a day. And then you say, I hate you. In Poland, there's this wonderful proverb about the peasant who finds the lamp in his field, and he rubs it, and a genie comes out. And the genie says, I have good news and bad news. For freeing me, I'll give you whatever you wish for. But the bad news is I have to give your neighbor double. What do you want? And the peasant thinks for a minute and says, blind me in one eye. Okay? People hate other people having more than they do. So digital is simultaneously making it harder for less skilled people to earn a living and making the lives of winners that much more visible. So it's a really tough problem for governments to solve. And that's why I'm not optimistic about long-term stability. And I mean long-term stability, not just in countries that shall remain nameless like mine that are a mess, but I even mean in seemingly stable places that might have 1.3 billion citizens and are still run by a central committee. And maybe it's that underlying instability that makes certain people like Mr. Xi suddenly say, you know, we used to change rulers, but now would probably not be a good time. I think I'll remain ruler for life, says Mr. Xi quite recently. So there's an ethical dimension. You're completely right. because there's a cultural change. And it's underlying both of those, though, is this material technological factor of digital. Does that answer your question, Yuri? And even if it's not...
Thanks a lot. I give the word to Victoria now.
Yes, we have some more questions in the chat. So one of them is concerning the news, actually. So one question, one second. So Alexandra is saying that Trump era widely introduced the fake news concept, which undermines the value of news per se. So every day we hear some news are fake, manipulated, or there is a witch hunt. If most or even all the news are fake, what does remain, if anything? Only controversial Twitter messages, selective truth? How do we navigate this?
Remember, Yuri asked about, well, you know, what about editors? What about, you know, and of course, one of the features of digital is news spreads with no editors all the time. So Trump didn't introduce it so much as magnify it. And the old medium of books and newspapers and television and radio all used editors, and editors are dead. Nobody edits anything anymore. And and at the same time, remember, the messages being sent are much more emotional because they're pictures, not words. It's very hard to make a rational argument. Oh, and remember, digital is also easy to fake. So the last election in India was called the WhatsApp election, which I suppose is great. But in 5 years, you're going to have a nation of over 1 billion people voting, and there are going to be WhatsApp videos floating around of the Pakistani prime minister, a fake video of the Pakistani prime minister sort of laughing his hands and cackling about nuking India or something. People will not be equipped to filter out real from fake news. It's even going to be hard for intelligence agencies to filter out whether a video is real or has been altered. I don't know what's left, to be completely honest. I know, though, that many institutions and value chains will be under pressure. And as business people, you've got a task. And it's easy to describe and hard to do. And I need you to become anti-fragile. Anti-fragile, I've never heard that word because it's a new word in English and I don't even like it. But let me tell you what it means. Of course, you know what fragile is. Fragile is something that breaks easily. And people think, well, the opposite of fragile is robust or strong. So you should be strong as a business person. That's good. But move robust or strong to the middle. And over here, I want you to put anti-fragile. Anti-fragile things aren't just robust. They don't just survive disorder. They profit from disorder. You as business people need to think of ways where disruption creates opportunity. And, you know, there are entire nations that benefit from disorder. Switzerland. They're like, oh my gosh, really? Your country's having a civil war? That is terrible. But it just so happens we'll accept your bank deposits. And there are a lot of businesses like, gosh, you know, I mean, obviously, if we'd all known a year ago, we would have started a hand sanitizer company or something that profits from the disorder of COVID. But more and more, as a business ideal, if we're entering this time of digital change, the worst thing you can do is assume that if a vaccine's invented tomorrow and it's at a reasonable price and it's freely available to everyone, digital change keeps happening. Everything I've talked about keeps happening. COVID goes away until the next COVID comes along. And as business people, be thinking about how do I profit from disorder? And sometimes that's about placing a lot of small bets and knowing that 9 out of 10 won't work out, but 1 will. And that's where you'll make your money. It's the way record companies used to operate. They would find 10 pretty girls who sing, pretty women who sing, excuse me, and they could all be equally talented, but only one is going to be a star. You just got to place a lot of bets. You can't bet on one star. So that was a very long answer to your question about fake news. But I think
we have a follow-up question, actually, speaking of bets and business strategies. So it's actually the one which you have on the agenda, because it has to do with global versus local. Alexandra is saying that with all the walls and tendency to nationalistic ideas, is it something that we may go to irrespective of the digitalization and internet, which as well, by the way, may turn into local, for example, in China, right? Right.
You've got at least 2 internets going, arguably 3, right? Because Russia's trying to do its own internet too, I thought.
Right. And I think there are a lot of aspects into that, right? There's obviously a business aspect, but then there's also the whole moral aspect. And I'm personally, for example, very worried about that as well, because, you know, I like this idea of global citizens and how the world is becoming
around it. I built a career around it.
Exactly. And then I'm very worried that we are actually moving far away from this concept.
I fear, Victoria, we are. But to come to the local question, I think because we're not going to head towards this, in my opinion, heading towards this global world where everybody suddenly says, you know what, things would be so much easier if we all just cooperated as a species. Okay, we're not headed there. So things get kind of worse. Take climate change and things like that. We're going to reach a point where problems are only solved probably at the city level. And of course, the medieval period was a period of the golden age of city-states, where like, hey man, I'd rather be from Singapore than from China, so to speak. I'd rather be, Shanghai is going to look after Shanghai. It's not all the citizens like, yeah, no, whatever happens in Xinjiang, I don't care. I'm just going to worry about Shanghai. Moscow is in effect, and Petersburg is in effect. You're going to see the rise of, for example, I can imagine a world in which the residents, the proven residents of cities have privileges that people who travel to the city don't have, just like the Middle Ages. So you're going to have city-states that can get stuff done for their citizens, pick up the trash, provide clean water, provide some basic security, things like that. And you really, it will be worth something to be a member of such a city-state, to be a citizen of such a city-state. And so the national identity will melt a bit under those conditions. Again, a return to the medieval. Cities trade with cities. You're already seeing it. Did that answer the question, I hope, a little?
Absolutely. I mean, Moscow is like a country inside a country. Indeed, that's already happening, I think, right?
Yeah, and obviously, none of these trends are completely new. You can always say Moscow's been its own thing, the way Rome was its own thing. Indeed, you could even say Moscow's the third Rome. I wouldn't, but some people do. Certain, particularly capital cities. You know, Paris has always been, I mean, I'm from Manhattan, right? And that's very different from Texas. But what will be different is more and more privileges and rights and identities will be wrapped up in that city-state almost, instead of the big national thing. And in fact, COVID, even as people are suggesting passports to come and go from clean areas. And those will probably be organized on a city by city.
You're right. We have seen a lot of evidence how cities actually were divided either digitally, you know, by having the kind of pass that you can use here, but you cannot use there. And you had to install a special application or indeed in a sanitary way, because some cities still remain under quarantine, and there's a real danger of closing some cities.
Yuri, and frankly, you look at the problem my country's having, the reason we're having the worst outbreak in the world is in fact because we can't get people to think that way yet. We're a nation started by revolutionaries where everybody says, it's my right, I don't need to wear a mask, I'm an American. Yeah, well, okay, and I'm a citizen of Manhattan, and I don't want you in my town. Take your cowboy hat off and put on a mask, or I don't want you in my town. And the only way you're going to control COVID is thinking that way, sadly. Because I like the big ideas. I can't be sentimental. The best service we can all do to things we love that are under pressure is to face squarely the implications of digital life in a COVID world. Because as I say, we're supposed to be talking about COVID, so I'll just give you my 2 cents. I am far more interested in news about effective treatments for people who already have it than I am about some miracle vaccine, okay? Maybe there'll be a miracle vaccine. So what? I'm 50 whatever, a little bit chubby. Just tell me you know how you're going to treat me when I have it. I don't need to hear how in 18 months, thanks to the valiant efforts of the People's Liberation Army, doctors, I'll be given a Chinese vaccine for this virus. I really don't. Or, wherever it comes from. I mean no disrespect to the People's Liberation Army's doctors who undoubtedly are doing their best to create a vaccine, but it's a different issue. Anyway, life isn't going back to normal anytime soon if you're a hotel or an airline or anything else. And Victoria, you and I are not going to fly as much as we used to.
Yeah, we will have to wait for some more time, I guess.
Actually, the big question in Russia is when European Union will open borders, because within our country we can already travel either with some COVID result or not, with special documents or not. We have heard that Europe is discussing passports of immunity.
Yes.
Actually, it's an interesting sociological event and phenomena. Like you have one passport, one foreign passport, and then one immune passport. Do you see any additional segmentation of people? And again, how ethical it becomes?
Today's Financial Times, Lufthansa has put in Frankfurt a system where you pay 119 euros and you wait something on, I think it's 2 hours, and you get your right to travel. They test you right there. They've contracted a testing agency in the airport for arrivals and departures. And
what if you come with a Russian passport? Will it be obliged?
Literally, Yuri, I don't think that there is a, and my wife is moderately close to this because she's border guards. I don't think there's a person on earth who knows the answer to that question.
Okay, we should be in touch with you to know the news first.
Well, what I know is I wanted to go to Greece this summer with my family, and they can, but I can't, or at least we think I can't, because I would be traveling on an American passport, and Americans aren't allowed into Greece right now. And so another way that, frankly, and in this way, and I don't want this to be a downbeat presentation, in many ways, when I say digital retrieves the medieval, I think, frankly, the Russian mentality is better suited to many aspects of the world than the European or American mentality. And what I mean is, Europeans and Americans often, at least Northern Europeans and Americans, they're not particularly interested in blot, right? It's all about, I have a piece of paper, therefore I have rights. And they're genuinely shocked when things are not the way they're supposed to be because they have a piece of paper that. And frankly, my experience of Russian life is everybody understands, yeah, you got a piece of paper, but I'm the border guy or whatever. And so when I want to go to Greece, my wife has a friend who's a Greek border guy who says, oh, don't worry, I'll give you a letter and everything will be fine. And should I really buy a ticket to go to Greece? And then I pull up my passport and he says, that's an American passport. You can't come in. And I say, oh no, but wait, we've got a friend. Eva's Polish. She's prepared to give it a try. Wow, really? That's how it works? So maybe you guys are more ready than we are, if insofar as you're not surprised by the power of things that aren't paper.
Yeah, and we have seen from our friendly associations, from Germans, from Americans, they have done a lot of job in letting actually highly qualified business individuals actually come in, sometimes against the normal regulations.
Right, against procedures. Yeah.
So if you are on a FSB list, you could enter even during the pandemic. Okay.
Enough, Nigel Farage was permitted to fly for national security reasons to attend the Donald Trump rally in Tulsa, even though supposedly no one's supposed to be flying from the UK. But when the president's friend wants it, it gets done. And honestly, in Scandinavia, for example, that would be a genuine scandal. But as we move away from the paper world, there's a little less scandal attached to exceptions because it's just reasonable. I lived in Italy for 6 years. I'm very used to that. Well, I never grew happy with that frame of mind, but I think we all have to get less obsessed by procedure created in the analog world.
Milo, we had one more question from Vladimir, which I think is quite interesting. He says that Uber approach has advantages, for example, decreasing costs and increasing availability of services. And so coming back to your comparison with Trump as Uber, could you please suggest advantages of Uberization in politics, if there are any?
Wow. I guess if you make golden toilets, the world is your oyster or something. I mean, it's wonderful if you're a Bulgarian. No, in all seriousness. The audience has created this artist. He is a symptom, not a disease. And as we think about our politicians, we shouldn't think about which politician might come next if the world were different. We should think about how do we create a new system that stops vomiting up such disgusting leaders. It's not a question of good czar, bad czar. I don't want a czar, and I particularly don't want a czar with such a terrible fake tan, like my own. But more than that, in all seriousness, there were people being underserved, and there were people being left behind by digital technology, and Trump gave them a voice. And honestly, most of my money remains invested in the United States because we've had worse times and come out stronger. And I'm actually convinced that we will come stronger out of all this protest against Trump and Black Lives Matter and everything else. When you break a bone, when it heals stronger. As Nietzsche said, how do you become new if you do not first become ashes? And what I'm more worried about than finding an upside to Trump, Trump is the upside. Trump is a version of proof that the system works, that people who needed a voice, well, in the country I live in now, in Poland, again, I profoundly dislike, frankly, I profoundly disagree with PiS, the current ruling party. But I do understand why roughly half the country supports them. And I want to live in a society with at least two choices, because I think having two choices over time, you end up stronger and better. And I would be very worried about, as I say, you know, many people think China's the coming thing. I'm nervous about Chinese demography, where they're going to have they've got 7 workers supporting every retiree now, but by 2050, that's 2 workers supporting every retiree. So Chinese culture's aging. Mr. Xi has 600 million Chinese living at an income level of Bolivia or lower. Foreigners go to China and they multiply everything by 1.3 billion. Poor Mr. Xi has to divide everything by 1.3 billion, and it's really hard. They've got water problems, they've got debt problems. China's not necessarily the coming thing, but it's also very brittle. When everything's so centralized, people say, oh, it's a pyramid, it's stable. It is a pyramid, but it's a pyramid this way, very unstable. Everything balancing on one person, very dangerous. So there's no upside to Trump other than the fact that in some ways, he proves the system works. Just like when one of my earliest political memories, this is a very long answer, forgive me, but it obviously touches a nerve. My earliest political memory is when America simultaneously managed to first lose the Vietnam War, and second, have the president resign in disgrace for organizing and then covering up the break-in of a party rival. And many people said, America is obviously doomed. No, we came out stronger. We quit fighting a war we couldn't win, and then we proved that no one's above the law. So, disorder, temporary pain, etc., does not always signal doom. It can signal strength. And I worry about systems that can't change fast enough in the digital era. This is why China obsesses over controlling digital technology. They fear what happens if they don't obsess over the control of digital technology. In my opinion, I don't have a direct line to President Xi.
Right. Thank you indeed, Professor Jones. I think you have been quite sincere and personal in some of your observations, and also brought some methodology to understand what is happening. Because sometimes people think very pragmatically. These technologies produce actually a fragmented world. You have a couple of seconds to understand anything, and it's a added advantage to have a professor to a little bit structure the phenomena. We would really promise to all the participants your presentation, and if you can include there your contact details so that some people can be in touch with you, possibly visit the campus when it becomes possible.
I'd love to.
And we'd like to invite you to Moscow when it becomes possible. And should you have any paper, you know, we have been thinking with Victoria to bring first Marco. Marco was on the verge of coming, but cancelled in a day. So we transformed and became stronger.
Skoro.
Yeah.
I'm easy to find on LinkedIn. That's the best way to contact me. I also I'm on Twitter at Invenium. There, it should be on the screen, I think, still. You will get all the slides, and I love Russia, and I love Russian culture and coming to Russia, and I want to get back very soon. I devoted a fair share of my life to trying to understand your wonderful country, in times good and in times bad, and I want to get back soon. And in the meantime, remember, find ways to profit from disorder, but to your point, find ethical ways to profit from disorder, because in the long run, that's actually the smart play.
Right.
That is in a world of where character matters more and more than paper, a good reputation becomes that much more valuable.
Okay, now let me also thank Victoria Susakova for her tremendous input in organizing this, and our partners from IE and also AmCham, and we hope to be in close contact with the chamber still. Thank you all that chose this lunchtime with us, and let me wish you a very good and fruitful afternoon, and stay healthy.
Yes, thank you very much, everybody. Please take care. And if you have any questions, I see that Tatiana, unfortunately, we didn't have time for your question. Please feel free to send it to me or to the association, and we'll forward them to Milo, and we'll try to get you the answers. All right?
Absolutely.
Thank you. Thank you very much, everyone.
Okay, have a great day.
Thank you.
Bye. Thank you.
Good day.